Hello and welcome to episode 13 of Conversing on Africa's Peace, a podcast focused on the African Union's Peace and Security Council and key related issues, produced as a collaboration between the Australian Embassy in Addis Ababa and Amani Africa Research and Media Services. My name is Adam and it's good to be with you. I'm joined by Amani Africa's Senior Researcher, Sion Hagos. Hi, Sion.
Hi, Adam.
Right, as always, let us begin this podcast by looking at the month just past, the month of September at the Peace and Security Council. Burundi was the chair of the PSC in September, and from your perspective, or from Amani's perspective, Sion, what were the standout sessions in September? I know you made a special intervention regarding the humanitarian situation in Sudan during the month, which I'd like to hear more about from you. But what else should our listeners be aware of in terms of the key outcomes from September?
First, thanks for having me back on the podcast, Adam. So that's correct. As you mentioned, one of the interesting sessions for September was the one on humanitarian situation. So we were invited to be among the briefers during this engagement that the PSC had with the UNHCR. It was basically convened as a follow-up, on the status of pledges that were made during the Malabo summit last year. So taking that opportunity, if you have a look at our statement, what it did was it tried to draw attention to the deteriorating humanitarian crisis in the continent with a specific focus on the situation in Sudan.
Yeah.
So as we have all been following, Adam, the conflict in Sudan is having one of the most devastating humanitarian consequences in the continent's recent history. You could find that 6 months into the conflict, there's nearly 6 million people that are recorded to have been forcibly displaced within and also outside of the country. So this shows that the impact of this conflict is it's clearly one that transcends the boundaries of Sudan.
Yeah.
And it clearly has massive crisis to the larger region as well. And we all know that this region is already characterized by years-long instability and insecurity.
Indeed.
So in light of this, was our briefing to the PSC tried to demonstrate, beyond emphasizing the need for a sustained engagement of the PSC on the situation, was to also show or to also sort of highlight the available avenues and also approaches that the AU, specifically the PSC, can use to more effectively respond to the humanitarian crisis. And one key recommendation that we made in this regard was the establishment of a task force that could monitor and also document and report back on the humanitarian situation and specifically on the protection of civilians from the ground in Sudan. So I think it would be interesting to see if the PSC will take this on from its future engagements.
Yeah, I think it was a very timely intervention by Amani, and it was nice to see some, well thought through analysis of the key problems facing not just the country but the region, but then also some creative suggestions on how to engage with the crisis, how to possibly, help make the situation a little bit less grim, which it certainly is. So good on you and Dr. Durso and the rest of the Amani team for putting that together. Looking very briefly across the rest of September, it was a busy month, they always are. Are there any other particular sessions you wanted to draw attention to?
Yes, definitely. There is the ministerial session, which took place
in New
York. But I thought we could come back to that one because we have a similar discussion during September, during this month.
Yeah, there's a lot of, it's multilateral sort of season between UNGA in New York and some pretty interesting visits and meetings going on here in Addis this month. So I appreciate your logic there. Very good. So on that note, I guess let's just charge into the month of October as the rainy season finally seems to be coming to an end here in Addis, and the sun's shining, and it feels a bit like the start of a new year in the diplomatic life of this great city. So for October, the Republic of Congo takes responsibility for chairing the PSC. At this stage, we know of 4 substantive sessions, which we can have a look at in turn. And as we've sort of touched on, the annual consultative meeting of the PSC with the UN Security Council membership. The PSC is also planning a field mission to Libya towards the end of October. So my understanding is that to start the month, the PSC Committee of Experts and the UNSC Working Group do some preparation for these meetings that we're going to talk about now. And then on the 5th of October, the PSC is going to hold its sort of 8th informal seminar with the UNSC. Working methods and financing of AU PSOs promise to be high on the agenda there, I imagine, Sion.
Yeah, that's correct, Adam. So, as I've just mentioned, this is one of the most interesting topics at the moment, the financing of AU PSOs. Like I just said, the PSC, the previous month, that's in September, already convened a ministerial session on the margins of UNGA.
Yeah.
So the communique of that session was released just a few days back.
Yeah.
And, among the key outcomes was PAC's request for the A3 to commence negotiations towards, generating consensus on the draft resolution.
Yeah.
And with the hope that this could be done in a way that could enable it to be tabled for consideration and adoption by the UN Security Council before the end of December 2023. So this basically, to an extent, it goes to show that the PSC is now trying to ensure that the momentum that has been created for adopting a UN Security Council resolution on financing of AU PSOs is taken full advantage of.
Yeah, because there really is some momentum all of a sudden. It feels people have been talking about this issue for a very long time, and it seemed like there was an eternal kind of stalemate.
Exactly.
And going back to the sort of start of this year, really, it's just been, we've talked about it 3 or 4 times on this podcast alone. So that's extremely interesting to see this breaking of the deadlock.
That's true. That's interesting. But it's also important to keep an eye on the fact that although there is a momentum, there are still some sticking points which need to be resolved.
Indeed.
So, I mean, we can expect to an extent that the coming informal joint seminar would also provide the opportunity to try and discuss and reach some sort of understanding on some of the issues, particularly those sticking issues,
those
such
remaining
as
blockages,
the sharing of burden sharing, issues around command and control. So we can expect that.
Fascinating. It's such an interesting issue. And then obviously with the UNSC having come all this way, on the 6th we're going to see the 17th joint annual consultative meeting between the AU PSC and the UNSC. How do these meetings normally play out? And like, it seems like it's a pretty packed agenda this year.
It does. We as you know, normally the main focus of the consultative meetings is to discuss regional and country specific issues.
Right.
This year the agenda envisages 4 conflict situations in Africa, and these are the war in Sudan, also the situation in the Sahel region, Somalia, and finally the DRC.
Yeah.
So this gives the 2 councils, the chance to address issues of complex political transitions, like especially in the Sahel region, but also issues of volatile security situation and the resulting humanitarian toll in these countries. So we can just briefly see what kind of issues could be addressed in each one of these countries. So with respect to Sudan, aside from the key points that I just mentioned earlier while reflecting back on the previous month, a critical issue that could receive some attention at the coming meeting is the very visible fragmentation of initiatives in the region. So not only does this fragmentation, entail a sort of, at times, duplication of efforts, and as a result, the ineffective use of resources, it could
Right.
also have a very counterproductive result. So one important topic for the PSC and UNSC, to reflect on and to discuss would be how to achieve a more inclusive and a more consolidated sort of peace process in Sudan.
Yeah.
So I think that would be interesting with regards to Sudan. When we come to Sahel, we could expect the two councils to address the pressing increase in terrorist attacks and also expansion of activities of terrorists in the region. But also a more recent threat that confronts the region is the spike in unconstitutional changes of government.
Absolutely.
The coup in Niger recently has brought on a lot of important questions, especially around the sort of response that various relevant policy actors need to take.
Indeed.
And aside from, reflecting on these issues, challenges that are associated with the withdrawal of MINUSMA from Mali and what that means for the regional security, could be some interesting aspects for the two councils to reflect on. Yeah. On Somalia, I might just mention a couple of points.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, the most obvious thing is the delayed drawdown of
Exactly.
ATMOS forces. Tell us a little bit about that.
No, yeah, I think that's exactly what we think would be central to the discussions of the two councils would be. There's been a request from Somalia to sort of delay for 3 months or to pause the drawdown process for phase 2.
Yeah.
So PSC has also endorsed at its last session on the 30th of September the issue of, they have endorsed the request made by Somalia. So perhaps the two councils can now discuss what the implications in financial and logistical terms would be if such poses actually.
Those financial and logistical implications will certainly be important, but I think with the recent sort of worrying uptick in kind of terrorist activity in Somalia against various actors, it certainly makes sense to perhaps press pause on the drawdown of ATMOS to see how best to go forward.
It might be the sensible option, that's true. That's true. The last situation on the agenda, of course, is DRC, Adam, and with respect to DRC also, basically we could expect, aside from, attacks by armed groups on civilians and also UN mission, the focus could be also around the status of international and regional responses.
Right.
And at the same time, also the upcoming general elections in DRC and what they could mean to the security situation as well.
Yeah, heavy topics for the 17th Joint Annual Consultative Meeting between the PSC and the UNSC. And, I'm sure the discussion will be extremely interesting, and we look forward to hearing of some of those outcomes in due course. Then, progressing on the 10th of October, the Peace and Security Council will once again receive a briefing on the humanitarian situation in Africa, this time by the ICRC. As we've touched on, Sudan springs to mind. The picture in general remains incredibly bleak across so many parts of Africa. What do you understand, or what do you think the ICRC will focus its briefing on this month?
Yeah, so just having regard to, some of the timeliest concerns within the humanitarian space, we could expect the focus of the briefing to be on the issue of access and also financing of humanitarian assistance, because these are two of the most critical issues on the continent at the moment. So the briefing could also present, sort of an overview of the nature of challenge that humanitarian workers are experiencing on the ground, especially in the face of today's reality of this shrinking space and access for humanitarian aid delivery. And aside from that, we might also hear certain things about the persisting direct attack against humanitarian workers on the ground. Yeah.
Which is never acceptable under any circumstances. Okay, well, that promises to be another interesting session. We've talked a little bit about the unconstitutional changes of government being a sort of running theme. On the 17th of October, we're going to see the only country-specific session for the month. My understanding is there'll be updates on the two most recent coups in Niger and Gabon, both of which are currently suspended from the African Union. Tell us a little bit more about what we can expect from this session, Siam.
So typically this would be a follow-up on PSC's previous sessions on these two countries, or the situations in these countries.
Yeah.
So with respect to Niger, the last PSC session, which was held on the 14th of August, it decided to, of course, like you mentioned, suspend the country from AU's activities, but it also endorsed ECOWAS's decision only relating to the imposition of punitive measures, but putting in the condition that there should be caution that this sanctions or this punitive measures rather should be applied gradually and also in a manner that minimizes the impact on ordinary citizens, which is interesting. But when it comes to ECOWAS's decision to actually deploy the standby force, the PSC simply took note of this decision.
Pulled short of full
endorsing,
or support.
And it also interestingly requested the AU Commission to actually conduct an assessment of the implications that this would have on Niger's economy as well as security.
Totally.
So it would really be interesting in terms of follow-up to hear back from the AU Commission what kind of assessment it has gathered in this respect at the coming session.
Yes. Yeah, I thought that was probably the most interesting part of that communique, actually. And the words were obviously chosen quite carefully. So, it will be interesting to see what the research project or whatever you want to call it has come up with.
From the AU Commission.
Yeah.
Would be interesting.
Yeah.
The other country, of course, is Gabon, as you've mentioned.
Yeah.
And with respect to Gabon, also an interesting decision that might pop up for the purposes of follow-up could be, the Council's call for the military to sort of interfere, cease interference in political situation at the threat of actually imposing sanctions or punitive measures. So it would be interesting to hear to see if the PSC will follow through in that respect. It would also be interesting to hear back if the AU Commission has indeed deployed a high-level mission to the country to engage with the stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely.
As per the PSC's request.
Now, you've given me a beautiful segue onto the next session, the 19th of October, when the AU PSC will discuss sanctions regime, which is also always a topic of pretty intense debate. So in light of these recent coups and changes of governments in Africa, how is the AU or the PSC thinking on sanctions evolving?
So it's interesting. Actually, last year the PSC already convened a session where it discussed the enforceability and the deterrence impact of sanctions imposed in specific as it relates to UCG or the issue of coups. So aside from that, an interesting point that popped up back then was the negative impact of economic sanctions on ordinary citizens, while perpetrators of coup largely remain unaffected by them. In light of this repeated occurrence of coups, particularly in West Africa and the Sahel region, as we mentioned, of course one of the main questions that might pop up or that all of us may have is, are coups really, are the sanctions being imposed really having any kind of deterrence impact? If not, and why? So this could be the point that the PSC can further interrogate at the coming session.
Yeah, it's a prickly one, and you can understand why some parties are motivated to try and use sanctions as a deterrent or as a punitive measure, but of course then that argument about them hurting the wrong people at times is also probably a valid one. So another fascinating topic in the second half of October there. As I mentioned at the introduction or at the start of the podcast, the PSC will undertake a field mission to Libya.
Yes.
to express solidarity, I suppose, with the Libyan people and to learn more about the situation on the ground there in terms, firstly, of course, of the peace and security situation, which remains extremely volatile, but also, to make matters worse, looking at the impact, I suppose, of the devastation coming out of Cyclone Daniel. What can we expect from this field mission?
Yeah, that's true. Like you mentioned, Adam, it's what makes this field mission a little bit different is that it's also happening just as Libya is experiencing this devastating impact of the cyclone, like you mentioned. I think for the PSC, it's one important point that we need to keep in mind is that the extent of the impact of the cyclone that it has had on Libya is a little bit more intense from other countries that have also been hit by the cyclone.
Yeah.
So I think it's also important to try and interrogate why this is. And of course, the response to that is the fact that Libya has had its infrastructure and facilities completely frustrated for years and years, as it has been in years-long conflict.
Yeah.
So what this tells us really is the kind of impact that conflicts have, even after they end, the extent of and the long-term impact that they have on communities and countries. So for the PSC as well, I think that's a major point to emphasize and to sort of say why we have to strengthen our preventive mechanisms as opposed to simply focusing on response and management mechanisms.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. Obviously, the recovery from the cyclone itself is going to take years, and that pace will probably be made slower by the other kind of political and economic factors at play. So I'm sure to be a real eye-opener for the PSC to get there and to see things firsthand.
That's true.
Okay, Sion, towards the end of October already, the Peace and Security Council, towards the end of the month, will consider the report of the chairperson of the Commission on Counter-Terrorism, which has become essentially an annual event in recent years, or at least it aspires to be annual. How does Amani see the African landscape in terms of counter-terrorism, radicalisation and violent extremism? I know we can talk about that for hours, but briefly, and what can we expect from the chairperson's report?
Yeah, so like you just said, we can talk for hours about our analysis of the terrorism situation. So maybe let me just focus on what we can really expect from the chairperson's report.
Please.
On the basis of, the previous report that was presented by the AUC chair, we could really expect to see some qualitative but also at the same time quantitative data demonstrating the trend and spread of terrorism. The report is also likely, to sort of flesh out which regions are most affected, whether there are any emerging trends in the methods and weapons used by terrorist groups, and also what the dynamics looks like in terms of primary targets of attacks. So these, as you can imagine, Adam, are of course very critical elements as they can inform and shape the kind of effective response that the AU and other regional mechanisms need to deploy in order to effectively respond to the threat of terrorism.
Okay, well, I look forward to that session and Amani's analysis of it in the aftermath. Yes. Okay, that neatly brings us towards the end of another month at the Peace and Security Council here in Addis Ababa, and to the end of another episode. We wish the Republic of Congo well as it takes the chair for October, and we wish everybody taking part in the work of the PSC productive discussions on the important topics outlined briefly here today. I'd also like to encourage people to dig deeper into the PSC's agenda by accessing Amani's range of PSC analytical products. The Australian Embassy is very pleased to be supporting the insights on the Peace and Security Council analysis of the PSC program each month, and we hope this podcast is a useful accompaniment to that work. Before we go, as usual, we'd like to wish the following African states happy National Days of Celebration in October. We have Nigeria on the 1st of October, Guinea on the 2nd of October, Lesotho on the 4th of October, Uganda on the 9th of October, Equatorial Guinea on the 12th of October, and Zambia on the 24th. We wish you all peace and prosperity. Finally, I'd like to thank everyone at Amani for their work on this podcast over the last year and a bit. I've enjoyed it immensely and have learned a lot. My posting to Addis Ababa is coming to an end this week, so I'll be leaving this capital of African diplomacy. But the podcast will continue without me, with the ongoing support of the Australian Embassy here. And I look forward to being a listener rather than a co-host, and I'm confident that Amani will take the podcast from strength to strength in the future. So that's all from me.
Thank you, Adam. And it's really sad to see you leave. But on behalf of Amani Africa and also myself, I'd like to wish you all the very best for the future. It's really been a great journey and a pleasure working with you on this podcast. Let me also thank our listeners for joining us for this month's edition of Conversing on Africa's Peace podcast, a collaboration between Amani Africa and the Australian Embassy in Addis Ababa. We do hope that you have a great month, and we'll be back next month to consider the PSC's agenda for November. Until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.